TDCA legislative update book. I can speak from personal experience that book is incredibly consumable by a lay audience, and everybody in the policy community appreciates the work that Shannon does on that. Mr. Edmonds also provides training, education, and assistance to members of TDCA and other legal and law enforcement entities. He's also written many articles and given many presentations on the legislative process and other varieties of legal topics, including capital punishment, prosecutorial ethics, DUI law, child abuse, gambling, and mental health issues. So without further ado, Shannon Edmonds from Texas District and County Attorney.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks to TPPF for having me. I'm glad I could fill in on short notice, and I know our prayers are with Chief McLaughlin's family. I kind of was sitting there thinking, well, gee, Mrs. Lincoln, other than that, how was the play? Yeah, let's end this right now. It sounds horrible. Of course, there is another side of civil asset forfeiture. And I want to go back to a phrase that some who've come to the policy primer that TPPF does every January have heard me use in the topic of overcriminalization, which is it's called the fence rule, something that G.K. Chesterton, a great thinker, came up with. He said, before you take down a fence, you need to sit down and figure out why it was put up. And then, if you can figure out that need is no longer there, take down the fence. So why was civil asset forfeiture created? Well, it was created in Texas in 1989. If you know your history, you know that 1989 was close to or the peak of crime, high crime in Texas. Compared to today, crime was 120% higher, the crime rate in Texas. We have cut crime by more than half in the last 25 years. Of course, now when you normally say that in front of a law enforcement group, that's an applause line, right? But look, in this building, it's what have you done for us lately? All right, it's hey, great, we're glad that you guys cut murders by 3 times and you've reduced property crime, but we're working on this budget. What have you done for us lately? But it's important to know that history. And the reason why civil asset forfeiture was created was because it was ridiculous that people would get criminally convicted of crimes and then law enforcement would have to give their property back to them because there was no mechanism for keeping them from enjoying the fruits of their ill-gotten labor. Crime shouldn't pay. We all know that. We learned that in elementary school. And that's what civil asset forfeiture is about. It's making sure that crime doesn't pay. So there are 2 aspects of it. It's not just what is done with it and whether it is used or misused, but it is taking those proceeds and those criminal instruments away from the bad guys. And I submit that civil asset forfeiture has been very, very successful in that regard over the course of its lifetime. So why are we reevaluating it now? Well, as I said, crime rate is at a 40-year low. You have to go back, at least in Texas, when we have 10 million more people in Texas than we did in 1984, but we had the same number of crimes. Okay, think about it, 10 million more people, the same number of crimes. What that means is that crime is not important to voters anymore. If you look at a poll of the issues that are most important to voters, crime and drugs pulls in about 3% of voters say that's the most important issue for them. Immigration, border security, the economy, jobs, healthcare, all those things rank above criminal justice in the voters' minds. Now, we've looked at polling, if you go back 20 years to 1994, the number of voters who said crime and drugs was the most important issue was 52%. So it just shows you how things have changed in the mentality of what's important to voters and what's important in this building. The other thing, the second thing that has generated some more interest in this, I think, is the rise of libertarianism on the right, which has been a big sea change. It used to be a pretty easy dichotomy in this building. You had on the left, you had the hug-a-thuggers, and on the right, you had the tough on crime, lock them up and throw away the key. And now you have a blending of the two, a meeting of the minds for folks who are libertarian. We're seeing an increase in that presence in Republican elections, okay? And one of the things that goes with that is not just that government should do a few things and do them well, but that government should stop doing things, stop taking my money, and that we need to shrink government, right? What was Grover Norquist's famous saying? I don't want to abolish government, I just want to make it small enough so that I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. And I mean, that's a great synopsis, tongue in cheek, but it seems like we have this mentality that any revenue generated by the government is bad. Because you can't shrink government if it has a source of revenue. We're seeing this some, I think, with the lottery debates. Long we've had opposition to lottery from social perspectives. The Baptist General Convention has been against it for a long time. Now we're seeing people who just think that government shouldn't have revenue, and so we need to get rid of it because we can't shrink something that has these outside sources of revenue other than tax fund. And that's something that's hard for law enforcement to understand, because they keep thinking, come on, Republicans are law and order, right? It's like, well, you gotta understand it. You are the government. If you wear a badge or you are a prosecutor, you are the government. And there is too much of you in the theory of many folks in this state and in politics now. So the second thing that has contributed to this rise in a debate about asset forfeiture is just the general distrust and desire to limit what government does. And then the third thing, of course, is always money. Money, money, money. Money always drives the train in this building. The same thing happens in your local commissioners' courts. I get tickled when I hear folks say, well, just give up asset forfeiture and then come to the Capitol and ask for that money. Because I can tell you, there isn't a single Republican who's going to be in the next legislature who won his primary saying he was going to spend more money. Not a one. Right? They came to cut. So it's really sort of disingenuous to say that that is a better option for law enforcement. If they were, and remember, prosecutors and law enforcement get almost no funding from the state government. Because there is reporting, we know that there's about, $142 million held by all the local law enforcement and prosecutors in the state. And that split is usually about 70 or 80% law enforcement, 20 or 30% prosecutors. I just looked up the budget of the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Their annual budget is $392 million. So all the law enforcement agencies in this entire state have less in their asset forfeiture funds than one sheriff's office. So, is it big? Well, it's all relative. But it is a problem when people abuse it. And that's something that I think Texas doesn't get enough credit for addressing. All right? This statute was created in 1989. I looked. It has been amended every session since then. Every session since 1989, that chapter has been touched. And in most cases, it's to expand it. Now, recently we've seen some attempts to limit it as well. And those have come from some of the horror stories that you've seen. And I'll give credit to Senator John Whitmire in the Senate. This has been an issue that's been very interesting to him, and he's taken the lead in making sure that some of those abuses are limited. And so when we hear things about margarita machine, they made fun of that really funny video in that John Oliver thing. It's a great kicker at the end. You definitely need to watch it. But that happened 10 or 11 years ago, and the DA lost his election. He finished third in a three-person race because of it. So we just had a DA up in Dallas who just was the darling of the media. He just lost his election in part because there are questions about how he was using his asset forfeiture money. And that's how it should be. There is an answer at the ballot box. And we also know that some of the reforms and oversight that have been put in place over the past 10 years by Senator Whitmire and others are working, right? The process is working in Dallas. So they're going to make sure that they get to the bottom of that. And what we're not seeing any of is what good comes out of it. Because government working properly is not news. It's not. It doesn't make for good clips. It doesn't make for funny John Oliver skits or something on The Daily Show. It's boring. And frankly, I'd be happy if asset forfeiture became nice and boring. All right? Prosecutors have worked with Senator Whitmire and others in the Capitol to make sure that asset forfeiture is used properly. And, I know Derek started off with quoting Roman law. I'm going to throw some Latin at you that came to my head. All right, although it was from St. Thomas Aquinas. Abusus non tollit usum. Misuse of something does not render it useless. Just because somebody abuses something doesn't mean it's bad. Okay? It just means that you need to address the abuses of it. And that's something that Texas has done very well lately. And so, I get interested when there's always two ways to see things. Matt's down there talking about this court system and civil court where the Harris County DA's office is hearing all these cases. What I think is, man, that is a hell of a lot of due process we're doing for $800, right? The prosecutors have to file a claim within 30 days or they have to give it up. They have to give notice to the owners, or if it's a vehicle, they have to track down whose name is on it and make sure that they know that their vehicle was used in a crime or that it's the proceeds of crime. They have to try to get them to court. All those things are exactly what I think most people want to happen, but you don't hear that it's happening because that doesn't fit the narrative that advocates want. And so I'm happy to be here and answer some of the questions. Hopefully we can have a good discussion about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Finally, Representative David Simpson is the state representative for House District 7, comprised of Gregg and Upshur counties. Since winning his first state election in 2010, Representative Simpson has served on the County Affairs, Land and Resource Management, and Joint Coastal Barrier Systems Committees. Prior to his service in District 7, Representative Simpson served several terms as the mayor of Abinger, Texas. In the private sector, he is the president and chief executive officer of Abinger Timber, LLC. Representative Simpson has a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Vanderbilt and is a graduate of the Trinity Ministerial Academy. Without any further ado, Representative David Simpson.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'd anticipated coming here really to listen and to learn, and I was asked to come and of late to speak about it. And I'm very glad to welcome a large delegation from my own district, District 7, Upshur and Gregg counties, our sheriffs and law enforcement and county judges, and police chief and assistant. Thank y'all for being here. Like many government ideas gone awry, the thought behind civil asset forfeitures may have had a kernel of sense in it when it was first conceived. The force of government should only be employed when one individual harms a neighbor. Then it is right that government forces restitution to the neighbor or to the public. And such restitution should include ill-gotten gains. Furthermore, it may be prudent for civil authorities to preclude the use of some property connected with criminal activity until conviction and sentencing has occurred. So there may be, and indeed be, a place for temporary or permanent forfeiture of property in the pursuit of justice. While our Constitution never contemplates injustice as a means to achieve justice, civil forfeiture laws have been codified and enforced unjustly. Knowing that the propensity of government is to overstep its bounds, the Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution to ensure its ratification and to prevent abuse of the powers that were granted. The Fourth Amendment provides that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue except upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The Fifth Amendment provides, among other things, that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Even a cursory reading of those provisions would inform an individual that the concept of forfeiture of assets should at a minimum require a warrant and due process before the government could take an individual's property. But that isn't what is happening. By now, many have heard about instances like those here in Texas where police targeted minorities driving in rental vehicles for traffic stops and then confiscated large amounts of cash through coercive means. In such instances, criminal charges were not filed and the individual was intimidated into signing over rights of property to avoid what they considered bogus charges being filed, or in one case to avoid having children taken and put into foster care. That's modern day highway robbery with a twist, where the white hat upholds up the coach and empties the pockets of the travelers, acting as judge and jury. How can they do that, you ask? Well, to get around those pesky little constitutional issues, legislatures, both state and federal, have created a dual system of justice, whereby the assets of an individual are named in a case, as we've heard, not the individual themselves. We have established laws in Texas and the United States where the owner of property is presumed guilty until they can prove their own property was obtained through legitimate means. The state has now a low threshold to show that property may have been used in illegal activity. The very presence of cash can be assumed to be a result of drug activity. We should not be proud of these means that effectively nullify, mute, or cripple constitutional restrictions on government power. In some states with higher standards of forfeiture than federal requirements, local and state authorities are now working with federal officials to seize assets and share the proceeds on an 80-20 basis with the initiating agency. In other words, law enforcement agencies are working in conjunction with the federal government to intentionally circumvent state law. Allowing participation in such situations is nothing less than selling our citizens to the federal government. If we expect a society of law and order, we must craft our laws to ensure justice is achieved justly. We cannot allow government to steal from citizens and then condemn the citizens for doing the same activity. The taking of assets from a citizen should not be easier than the conviction of a crime. Reforms in the area of civil forfeiture should include: citizens and their property should have a presumption of innocence. The burden of proving that property was the result of ill-gotten gain should be on the government, not the accused. And it should have the same standard as a criminal case. The way it is now, the owner of property has to prove, and many times, a negative. Also, we should check improper motives. Proceeds from seized assets should be directed to crime victims or indigent defense rather than to fund law enforcement. Law enforcement should not fund itself. It should be funded through the budgetary process. Furthermore, the government should not retain property unless there is first an indictment and second a conviction for serious crime. Moreover, there should be appropriate requirements of timeliness to ensure this provision is not abused. Property should be returned in good condition, and law enforcement should not have immunity for damage that results in financial injury to an innocent owner. We have a constitution of liberty and limited government. They stand or fall together. Liberty used irresponsibly produces more government. But a government that uses force unnecessarily or unreasonably not only reduces individual liberty, but it invites anarchy. It is not good government. In East Texas, we have a saying: fences keep the honest people out. Our Constitution is a fence that we need to keep and maintain good government. Thank you, and I welcome an opportunity to discuss this with you further, especially from my own delegation.
Thank you, sir. So now we begin our question and answer period. If you'd like to approach the microphone right over here on the other side of the post, we will get to as many people as possible. But just to kick it off, I'd like to take the moderator's prerogative and direct a question at Matt and Andrew. Why, and you both highlighted this in your remarks, why is federal reform important part and parcel with state reform?
Sure, yeah. Well, is this on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So I think the main reason that federal reform is important is due to the fact that the feds account for a large proportion of these seizures, and because state and local law enforcement, when hampered by procedural rights and reforms at the state level, often will say, hey, to the feds, we've got this great case, and then launder the money more or less through the feds, and the feds give them the kickback of 80%. Now, there's a reason for equitable sharing. There's a place for it, I think, in certain circumstances, but it's certainly now being abused. But if I could just, one thing that I wanted to point out was the point about libertarianism on the right, and is this just a libertarian moment? Is that what we're seeing? My organization is quite conservative, and yet, and let me also talk about reform. Reform in 2000 was spearheaded by Representative Henry Hyde, my former rep, who was no, wilting lily. He also, you've heard of the Hyde Amendment, the prohibition on use of federal funds for abortion, and was him as well. Extremely socially conservative, extremely law and order, and he was the guy that was in favor of federal reform back in 2000. So I don't think that it's a libertarian thing. I think it's a good government, good practices sort of a thing, and I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, well, since we have questions queued up, let's go to the forum.
Yeah, my question, local law enforcement agencies, they receive sometimes revenue from state agencies in the form of equipment grants or other things, or even from the federal government. In deciding those grants, should they be looking at how much money the local law enforcement is getting from civil asset forfeiture, and kind of saying, if you're getting revenue sources from seizing all this money, maybe you don't need as much grant money to cover your expenses?
My concern with that is that it would increase the use of civil forfeiture instead of decrease it, because then you would wind up with a shortfall. So my initial read on it, and I haven't studied it, my initial read on it is that could create more problems than it might solve.
Certainly. That was a great question. Yes, Chad.
You're way too tall for me to show this. I apologize. The other problem with forfeiture is it's difficult to budget for. It's not a ready revenue stream like it is from your commissioner's court or from the state. So if an agency is relying on seizures off of a local interstate, those can vary greatly depending on what path through the country the drug gangs decide to use. And as they switch from one route to the other, forfeitures can go up and down, so it's very difficult for law enforcement agencies to use it as a budgeting tool as well. But it's certainly something that you can take into consideration in grant funding just in general, but it's very difficult to project forward what that's going to be.
I think that points out one reason why it's important to have general processes for law enforcement, precisely because it's hard for them to rely on this. Although, interesting point, many do. DC, for example, has budgeted tens of millions of dollars in forfeiture funding, which federal regs say don't do that, but they do it anyway.
I think it's dangerous anytime that we chase federal dollars. When we do so, we often lose our independence. And I think it's important that we never sacrifice principles for dollars. On the other hand, I just want to say that I think forfeiture, of assets to pay for a crime is a part of justice and should be done. I support criminal forfeiture based on the conviction, being charged and convicted of a crime. That's important. And that is what justice is. If you've obtained the gains through criminal activity, those gains should be restored to those who they didn't take it from. And if we can't track them, it should go to the public. And it should pay for the system of justice. So I have no problem with forfeiture when it's used with due process.
Well, Gary, I feel compelled to answer a question about grants. Currently, I'm the head of the Criminal Justice Division at the Governor's Office, and we do criminal justice grants. And one of the things that we've been struggling with over my tenure there has been the question of civil forfeiture. You know, what kind of money do some of these jurisdictions have? And we do ask jurisdictions to provide us with the information as to what they have in the forfeiture accounts. It's been hard getting to this point, but I think it's getting better. So that kind of leads to my main question, I guess probably directed mainly towards Shannon, would be, would your organization, or do you think the law enforcement community would be against at least having the forfeiture money that comes in at the state level go into GR so we could precisely avoid some of these budget questions?
Thanks for asking. That is not something that has been discussed among our group. My gut feeling is that they would not be in favor of that. Maybe because part of the experience, if you're in the criminal justice system, is the state constantly taking money out of the criminal justice system, charging fees, fines, court costs, and things like that that the state uses to fund non-criminal justice issues. It's very frustrating to everybody in the system, prosecutors, defense lawyers, and other folks. And so their experience dealing with the legislature is that usually the money goes one way, the wrong way, between local courts and state government. And I also always get kind of tickled when you have this cognitive dissonance between folks who are, local government, or limited government, local control. Oh, but let's send it all to Austin. That doesn't compute to me. I think the folks locally are in the best position to decide what their needs are and what that money should be spent with. And the other thing you need to know right now is that prosecutors and law enforcement and commissioners and city councils argue all the time over what that money is, because your commissioners and city council members want to get that money and use it for non-criminal justice purposes. And that's very frustrating to law enforcement, who aren't being adequately funded to begin with. So that's kind of how we've ended up in this situation right now. But now, to answer your question, I'm guessing that wouldn't be that popular.
Mr. Edmond, during your talk, I think we all agree that crime shouldn't pay. You're going to have a hard time anywhere agreeing with you on that. And what seems to follow from that then is that criminal forfeiture, where someone has been convicted of a crime, should follow, and thus we should be able to take their money. And so would you support the elimination of civil asset forfeiture and only allow for criminal forfeiture? And if not, I guess I'm wondering, you said abuses do exist, and I work at the Institute for Justice. We have no problem finding victims of civil forfeiture or abuse. So if these abuses exist, we're in a state legislature. I'm wondering what reforms you actually do support.
Sure. Well, and I'll tell you that I'm here, at the last minute, and I work in TDCA, but our association will not take a position on this. We have 330 elected prosecutors, and our job is to tell them what's going on here at the Capitol, and let those elected officials get involved in the legislative process and decide what they want to support or oppose. And on something like marijuana, man, our folks are going to be all over the map on that this session. That's another new phenomenon that we're going to see. So I just give that as a little disclaimer to begin with. One of the questions I have, because we don't have criminal asset forfeiture here that requires a a conviction already, is the timing of this. You know, Mr. Miller talked about seeing this civil process go on, because it is property, right? We're not convicting a person, we're trying to decide what to do with the property involved in that crime. And in order to get it back quickly to the right people, if the state shouldn't have it, we have accelerated timelines. So the state has to decide within 30 days whether or not to file this forfeiture lawsuit or not. Now keep in mind, these are felony cases, and in a felony, the state can take up to 6 months to indict a case already. So in these